The sun had barely begun to set over the quiet suburban neighborhood when Ethan Blackwell's frustration reached its peak. It was the same every damn day, a dusty, grease-slick garage, an engine that refused to cooperate, and a half-empty can of soda that was quickly losing its battle against the summer heat. He wiped his hands on his worn-out jeans and stared down at the stubborn car engine in front of him. He'd been at it for hours, but the damn thing just wouldn't start. Ethan let out a growl, slamming the hood shut with more force than necessary. "Come on," he shouted to no one in particular, his voice raw with frustration. "Start already." As if the universe had a cruel sense of humor, the moment his words echoed into the evening air, the ground beneath him trembled. It wasn't an earthquake. No. This was different. This felt like the very fabric of space was quivering, straining against some unimaginable pressure. Ethan stumbled back, staring wide-eyed as the air around him crackled with an unnatural energy. Then, with a sound like the universe itself tearing in half, a rift appeared above him. It wasn't a hole in the air, not like a black hole or a tear in the sky. No, it was more like a window, a thin, shimmering veil between dimensions, and through it, Ethan could see the wild, chaotic dance of fire, water, wind, and earth. Before he could finish his sentence, a surge of wind blasted through the garage, knocking over a stack of old tools. The rift widened, and with it, a torrent of elemental chaos poured out. A flame shot toward him, small and delicate, flickering in the air like a firefly. It zoomed around his head, then darted toward a nearby shelf of metal parts, igniting them in an instant. Then, a column of water surged through the garage door, spiraling in midair before splashing against the walls and leaving puddles all over the floor. "What the hell?" Ethan said again, now completely baffled. Then came the wind, a gust so fierce it pushed Ethan into a stack of tires, knocking him to the ground. He was too stunned to react, watching in awe as the air swirled around him like a tornado. But instead of ripping everything apart, the wind seemed to be dancing. It twirled in spirals, like a ribbon caught in an invisible breeze. Finally, a massive a boulder crashed into the side of the garage. It didn't shatter or break. Instead, it bounced once before hovering in mid-air, as if frozen in time. Ethan's jaw dropped. "This isn't happening," he muttered under his breath. He stood up slowly, wiping dirt and oil off his clothes, and glanced at the open rift above him. The crackling, shifting rift seemed to pulse, almost as though it were alive. He looked at the firefly-like flame, which had now settled into a swirling mass of sparks, then at the floating rock, and finally at the water still cascading around him. The room was a mess. His garage was a war zone, but the strange chaos around him didn't feel dangerous, at least not in the traditional sense. It was like an uncontrolled magic trick, an accident waiting to happen. Then, with a sudden crack, the rift pulsed one last time, and just like that, it snapped shut. Silence fell, leaving Ethan standing there, drenched in water, covered in soot, and utterly dumbfounded. "Okay," he said to himself, his mind trying to catch up with what had just happened. "I need to sit down." He backed into a chair and sat, staring at the aftermath of the chaos. It was like someone had thrown nature into a blender and let it run wild. The firefly flame had evaporated, the water was already drying up in streaks across the concrete, and the boulder that had been floating was now sitting on the ground, as if it had never moved. The only thing that remained was a strange tingling in the air, a faint crackling energy, like static electricity just before a storm. It was at that exact moment that the door to the garage creaked open. A tall, elegant woman stepped through, her black leather jacket reflecting the dimming sunlight. She had an aura of controlled confidence, and though she wore a pair of black sunglasses despite the fading light, there was something unnerving about the calm way she entered the scene. "Quite a mess you've made here," she said in a voice that could have belonged to a professor. "I take it you've had your first encounter with the elements." Ethan blinked, still processing the surreal events that had just unfolded. "Who the hell are you?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer to the wreckage, her gaze shifting from the scattered tools to the puddles on the floor and finally, to the boulder resting by the wall. "I'm Celine Ashford," she said, as though that explained everything. "And you, Ethan Blackwell, are a problem." Ethan stared at her. "A problem? I'm the one with a broken engine, lady." Celine raised an eyebrow. "Not anymore. You've broken something far worse than an engine." She snapped her fingers, and the boulder, without a hint of gravity, lifted into the air, hovering in front of her like a balloon. "You see," she continued, "you've just caused a rift in space-time. And you are now the key to fixing it." Ethan's mind spun. "A rift? Space-time? Key? I don't know what you're talking about," he said, getting to his feet. "I'm just a guy fixing a car." "I don't have—" "You do now," Celine interrupted, her tone sharper than before. "You have the power to control the elements, or at least, you will once you get your act together." Ethan stared at her, eyes wide. "I what? Me? Control the elements? I just broke my garage and almost got hit by a flying rock, lady. I think you have the wrong guy." "I don't," she replied coolly. "Your powers were awakened the moment that rift appeared. It's no accident that it happened here. Or, more precisely, it's no accident that you were the one to cause it." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, Celine's gaze sharpened, her eyes narrowing as she looked past him, out the open door. Her posture tensed, and she spoke in a quiet, urgent voice. "We don't have time to explain it all now. The rifts are spreading. And you're going to have to help close them. You're the only one who can." Ethan's mind raced. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, a strange force he didn't understand. "Wait, you're serious? You want me to stop these things?" "Yes," Celine said, her voice unwavering. "And I'll help you. But we need to act quickly." Okay, Ethan muttered, still trying to wrap his head around everything. "But where do we start?" Celine turned toward the horizon, where the last light of day was fading. "The first rift is close. I need you to come with me. We don't have much time before things get worse." Ethan hesitated for a moment. Then, with a deep breath, he stood up straighter. "All right. But I'm gonna need a crash course. Because so far, I'm still trying to figure out how I didn't just blow up the whole damn neighborhood." Celine shot him a sideways glance, her lips twitching in a brief, knowing smile. "We'll get to that. But for now, we need to stop the chaos you've unleashed before it destroys everything." Ethan nodded, still trying to piece it all together. But there was one thing he knew for sure: the rest of his life was about to get a whole lot weirder. Under the fading light of the sun, Ethan followed Celine Ashford through the quiet suburban streets. He'd barely processed what she had said, his mind still buzzing from the strange explosion of elemental chaos in his garage. Each step he took felt surreal, like he was moving through a dream or maybe a nightmare, depending on how you looked at it. A few hours ago, his biggest worry had been the car engine that wouldn't start. Now, he was walking toward the unknown with a woman who was talking about space-time rifts and elemental powers as if it were all part of the daily grind. Celine didn't waste time with small talk. She kept her pace quick, her eyes scanning their surroundings as if she were expecting trouble to pop up at any moment. Ethan couldn't decide if he should be amazed, scared, or irritated. Probably all three. "All right, so," he said, keeping his voice casual to mask the uncertainty, "you said I'm the key to fixing these rifts, right?" Celine glanced over her shoulder, her face unreadable. "That's correct. But I don't know anything about what happened back there. I mean, one minute, I'm trying to fix a damn engine, and the next, there's a rift in space-time. I have no clue how I caused it." "You're not the cause, Ethan. At least, not in the way you think." Her voice was steady, but there was a faint tension behind it, as though she was weighing how much to reveal. "The rifts are a result of something far larger. You were chosen. The power you have isn't random. You're a conduit, a link to the elements themselves. I'm a what? She slowed her pace just enough to glance at him, her lips curling into something that almost passed for a smile. A conduit. You've always had this potential inside you. The rift just triggered it. Now, your powers are awakened. You can control the 4 elements. Ethan blinked, trying to wrap his head around that. Control the elements? Like fire? Water? Wind? Earth? Exactly. You don't just control them, you are them. You're tied to them. But right now, it's messy. Ethan stopped walking for a moment, staring at her as if she'd just told him he was the heir to an ancient alien dynasty. Wait, hold up. I don't even know how to control the air conditioner, and you're telling me I can summon fire? It's more than that, Celine said, moving a little ahead of him. You don't summon the elements. You're connected to them. But it's raw right now. Unrefined. You'll have to learn to harness it before the rifts grow worse. They're multiplying faster than you think. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. What happens if we don't fix them? The balance between dimensions will collapse. The elements will consume everything. All reality as you know it will unravel. Well, that's not good, Ethan muttered, feeling a wave of panic rise in his chest. Celine didn't acknowledge his words, but she did glance at him out of the corner of her eye, as though considering something. I know this is a lot to take in, but you don't have much time. Every rift you close will take more of your energy, and I'm not sure how much longer you can hold up before. A low rumble interrupted her, and the ground beneath their feet shook for a brief second, as though an earthquake were passing beneath them. Ethan's heart leaped in his chest. The crackling energy in the air from the rift was still fresh in his mind. Is that another one? He asked, voice tense. Celine nodded, already taking off toward the source of the tremor. We don't have time for this. Follow me. They pushed through the streets, and Ethan's thoughts scrambled to make sense of it all. He'd always thought of himself as an ordinary guy. Hell, he was just a mechanic. A guy who liked simple things, a good car, a beer, a quiet night. Now he was running through the streets with a woman who seemed to know everything about some weird cosmic event he'd accidentally triggered. And he was supposed to fix it. A sense of urgency grew in his chest as they neared the source of the disturbance. A few blocks away, there was a park, a quiet little green space with a pond and some playground equipment, the kind of place where people usually walked their dogs or had picnics on a warm evening. Except now, the park was anything but peaceful. The air around it shimmered with an eerie glow, and the ground beneath the trees was cracked open like a wound. The pond, which had once been a calm, reflective surface, was now a roiling mass of water, swirling in unnatural, unpredictable patterns. It was as if the laws of nature had decided to take a vacation. Stay close, Celine warned, her voice tight as she moved toward the edge of the park. Ethan took a step forward but stopped when the wind began to pick up around him. The air turned thick, heavy with tension. His heart raced. He felt something inside him stir, a strange pressure building up in his chest. He was supposed to control this? To fix the rift? He didn't even know where to start. Then, something shifted in the air. A gust of wind slammed into him, pushing him backward. He staggered, but managed to catch himself on a nearby bench. Ethan, you need to focus. Celine's voice cut through the wind, sharp and commanding. Focus? Ethan shouted back, struggling to keep his balance as another gust of wind pushed at him. I don't know how to focus. I don't even know how to. He cut himself off as he felt something flicker inside of him. It wasn't his voice, or his mind. It was more like an instinct, a gut feeling, deep in his core. The sensation was so foreign, so alien, that for a moment he thought he might be imagining it. But then, the pressure inside him intensified, and he realized, it was the elements. The fire, the water, the air, the earth, they were all connected to him now. Without thinking, he lifted his hands in front of him. He wasn't sure what to do, but instinct kicked in. He spread his fingers, and a gust of wind surged out of him, rippling through the air with a power he didn't know he had. The wind didn't just blow around him. It responded. It twisted around his body, a living thing, guided by his own frantic energy. The trees around him swayed, bending with the force of the wind, but not breaking. The rift at the park's center began to close, slowly, as though the very air was pushing it back. Celine watched him intently, her face showing no surprise, only focus. "That's it, Ethan. Keep it up. You're on the right track." He concentrated, willing the wind to push harder, to force the rift back into place. But the power was draining him. He could feel it, the toll this was taking on his body, the weight of the energy crashing through him like waves. He stumbled, his knees shaking, but he didn't stop. The swirling water began to calm, settling into a more predictable flow. The earth around the park began to settle, the cracks mending themselves as if time itself were reversing. The rift began to shrink, pulling back into the air, like a wound slowly healing, but Ethan could feel it. The strain was too much. His vision blurred at the edges, and he could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He wanted to stop, but the power surged through him, and he couldn't. He was too far gone now. There was no stopping it, Ethan. Celine's voice broke through his haze, sharp and urgent. "You need to stop." But he couldn't. The energy had taken hold, and he was too deep in it now. With one final burst, he shoved the rift closed, the air crackling with a sharp, almost electric sound. The ground beneath him steadied. The wind died. And the park returned to its usual stillness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The rift was gone. The park was peaceful again. Ethan's body, on the other hand, felt like it had been hit by a freight train. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath. Celine was at his side in an instant, kneeling next to him. "You did it," she said, her voice surprisingly soft for someone who'd been so no-nonsense before. "But that took a lot out of you. You're not ready for this kind of strain." Ethan tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and his body felt like it belonged to someone else. All he could manage was a weak shake of his head. "I don't know if I can do this again." Celine looked down at him, her expression unreadable. "You have no choice. There are more rifts, Ethan. And they're only going to get worse." Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of it all crashing down on him. He was exhausted. And scared. But one thing was certain, he was in this now. Whether he wanted it or not, Ethan lay on the grass, the cold blades against his skin grounding him in reality, but that reality felt increasingly foreign. His heart pounded erratically in his chest, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins, though his body felt heavy and distant. His hands were shaking, as if the raw power that had surged through him had left an indelible mark on his very being. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to push himself up, but every movement seemed to pull more of the energy out of him. Celine crouched beside him, her presence calm, like a steady anchor in a sea of chaos. She didn't say anything at first, just let him breathe, let the tension fade a little before speaking again. "You're not ready for that," she said quietly, her voice betraying none of the urgency that had been there moments before. "You're too new to this." Ethan didn't answer. He just lay there, staring up at the fading sky, his mind still reeling. He had stopped the rift, yes. But he wasn't sure how. The wind had answered his will, yes, but the connection between him and the elements felt raw, almost too much to bear. He'd nearly collapsed after one rift. What would happen if there were more? "You did well," she added after a pause, her voice softening slightly. "You stopped the rift. Most people would have lost control completely. You held it together." But Ethan couldn't focus on the praise. "Not now. I didn't know what I was doing. I don't know if I can do this again. I feel," he trailed off, his head feeling too heavy for his neck, as if it were full of stones. "You will do it again," Celine said, the firmness in her tone brooking no argument. "And you'll get better at it. But we don't have time for hesitation." Ethan forced himself to sit up, the world spinning slightly as he did. "Time," he repeated, trying to focus on her words. "For what?" Celine stood, her eyes scanning the park around them, the wind shifting at her back. The air was still now, but Ethan could feel the tension in her shoulders. "The rifts are spreading," she said, the gravity of her words sinking in. "The first one we closed was just the beginning. If we don't act fast, the next ones will be even more dangerous." Ethan pushed himself to his feet, swaying for a moment before finding his balance. He wasn't ready, wasn't sure how he was supposed to do this, but there was something about the determination in Celine's eyes that made him want to try. He couldn't be the weak link. "Not now." "Where to next?" he asked, his voice rough. It wasn't that he felt confident, but something inside him, some primal instinct, pushed him to move, to act, to stop the chaos. Celine didn't waste time. She turned sharply, gesturing for him to follow her. "We'll take a car. The next rift's opening soon, and it's already close to the city. We need to be there before it destabilizes further." Ethan nodded, trying to push down the unease that settled in his stomach. His mind felt like it was slowly catching up to the present, each thought a weighty realization. He was about to dive headfirst into a world he didn't understand. But he wasn't the kind of person to run away from a challenge. At least, not anymore. The drive to the next rift felt longer than it should have. The city skyline loomed ahead, its towers etched in sharp contrast against the setting sun. Ethan had barely spoken during the ride. He couldn't, not with the constant buzz of elemental energy still lingering under his skin. His hands gripped the seat, his mind trying to shut out the nagging voice that wondered what kind of hell he was getting into. Celine drove with the kind of focus that made it clear she was used to high-stakes situations. Her eyes never strayed from the road, her hands steady on the wheel. She'd told him little about herself, only that she was part of a group called the Elemental Order, which dealt with things like this: the rifts, the elemental forces, the balance of the dimensions. They didn't have time for explanations, she had said. She was a guide. Ethan was the key. That was all that mattered now. The hum of the engine seemed to reverberate against his thoughts. He felt a strange sensation, like a whisper at the back of his mind, almost as if the elements were calling to him. The wind, the water, the fire, the earth, they were all still inside him, pushing at the edges of his consciousness. He couldn't control them yet, not fully. And that scared him more than anything. Celine's voice broke the silence. "We're getting close." Ethan snapped his gaze forward. There, in the distance, the sky was rippling like water disturbed by a stone. It wasn't a storm, but it wasn't natural either. The colors around the rift were shifting hues of red and purple, swirling in a mesmerizing yet terrifying pattern. It was as if the fabric of the world was unraveling at the seams. As they neared the rift, Celine's grip on the wheel tightened. "Stay alert. This one won't be as easy as the last." Ethan felt his heart beat faster. He could feel the rift's energy now, pulling at him, like a magnet calling him to the center of it. His palms were sweating, his throat dry. Celine took a sharp turn into a narrow alley that led to a small park near the edge of the city. The rift was even more chaotic here, a swirling mass of energy that threatened to tear apart the space around it. The ground beneath their feet was beginning to crack open in places, and the air felt thick, as though the rift was warping the very molecules of the atmosphere. Without another word, Celine got out of the car, her expression intense, focused. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before following her. "Ready?" she asked, though there was little question in her tone. "I don't think I have a choice," Ethan muttered under his breath. His legs were heavy, but he moved toward the rift, feeling the pull of it as if it were calling to him, demanding that he do something. He didn't know how to stop it. He didn't know how to control the forces inside him. But something in him was beginning to realize that he didn't need to have all the answers. Not yet. He just needed to try. Celine extended her hand toward the rift, her fingers crackling with energy. Focus on the core of the rift, she instructed. Find the center, the source of the imbalance. The elements are being torn apart. You need to bring them back into harmony. Ethan nodded, though he still wasn't sure what that meant. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breathing. And then he let it happen. The elements began to stir within him. It was like a storm breaking, violent, chaotic, but also beautiful in its intensity. He could feel the fire inside him, wild and untamed, the water cool and flowing like a river, the wind twisting around him, and the earth grounding him, steady and unyielding. That he didn't summon them, not in the way he thought he would. Instead, it was like they were always there, just waiting for him to acknowledge them, to accept them as a part of him. The power surged through him, and for a split second, Ethan felt like he could conquer the world. He reached out, and the rift trembled, but then the energy began to overwhelm him, the elements tearing at his control. He felt like he was drowning, like he was being pulled apart by forces greater than he could comprehend. Focus! Celine shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. You're stronger than this. Steady yourself. Ethan gritted his teeth, drawing on everything inside him. The wind, the water, the fire, the earth, they weren't enemies. They were parts of him. The moment he realized that, he felt the rift begin to close, slowly at first, then faster. The wind subsided, the fire dimmed, the earth settled, and the water calmed. He didn't know how long it took, but the rift finally collapsed in on itself, the air around them clearing with a sharp snap, like a balloon popping. Ethan's legs gave out again, but this time, he was ready for it. He dropped to his knees, breathing heavily, but this time, the exhaustion felt different. It was the exhaustion of a battle fought and won. Celine was already kneeling beside him, her face unreadable, but there was something like respect in her eyes. You're learning faster than I expected, she said, her voice surprisingly approving. That was the hardest one yet. Ethan wiped his face with the back of his hand, trying to catch his breath. Great. But I'm not sure I can do that again. You don't have a choice, she replied softly. There's more to come. And we'll need you ready. Ethan's mind was spinning. He wasn't sure how much more he could take. But as he looked at Celine, the resolve in her eyes felt like a call to arms, and somewhere deep inside him, something had changed. He might not be ready yet. But maybe he could be, and there was no turning back now.